Of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause. Hi, I'm Vanessa Mazzandi, a second-year resident at Boston Children's, and today I'll be reviewing the toxin, pathophysiology, and theories surrounding the death of the king in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Shakespeare's Hamlet tells the story of a young prince set on a path of revenge so bloody that it leads to the death of nearly every major character in the play. While much is written about Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, where he debates the merits of suffering life's pitfalls versus ending one's existence, from a medical perspective, I think the most interesting words come from the character who drove Hamlet to consider such things, the ghost of his late father, the king. In Act 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's dead father appears to him and shocks his son with the story of his murder. The ghost tells Hamlet, "Sleeping within my orchard, upon my secure hour, thy uncle stole with juice of cursed Henbane in a vial, and in the porches of my ears did pour the leprous distilment, whose effect holds such an enmity with the blood of man that swift as quicksilver it courses through the natural gates and alleys of the body, and with a sudden vigor doth posset and curd like eager droppings into milk the thin and wholesome blood. So did it mine, and a most instant tedder barked about, most lazar-like, with vile and loathsome crust, all my smooth body. Thus was I, sleeping by a brother's hand, of life, of crown, of queen, at once dispatched. O horrible, most horrible." The words of the late king's ghost set in motion the plot of Shakespeare's Hamlet. The ghost not only plays the pivotal role of giving young Prince Hamlet his motivation to forward events in the play, but he is also kind enough to provide intimate details of his murder, including the time, the place, the poison used, and later the symptoms it brought upon his body. So then, if the ghost was this clear, why have there been so many articles querying just how Shakespeare's King of Denmark met his end? Let's start with the poison in question, Henbane. Black henbane is grown all over the world and certainly could have been found in Denmark near the sleeping king. Can toxins in the plant cause the death of a human? Absolutely. Black henbane, also known as Hyoscyamus niger, is part of the nightshade family and contains alkaloid anticholinergic substances, all familiar to us, all used in medicine today: scopolamine, its chemical twin hyoscyamine, and atropine. But more than acting as a cure for motion sickness, stomach cramps, and symptomatic bradycardia, henbane can be used to kill. Even the name is derived from one of its more sinister uses. The Anglo-Saxon derivation of hen, meaning chicken, and bana, meaning murderer, reflects its use by hen thieves of old. Mixing henbane with grain ensured the hens would be passed out and thus not awaken their owner when stolen. Henbane has also been used throughout history as a poison. Fortune teller Catherine Voisin was a famous French abuser of henbane during the late 1600s. She used it to poison thousands of aristocrats in King Louis XIV's court before she was caught. Then take the case of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, who used hyoscyamine to murder his wife, Cora. The story of Dr. Crippen is actually pretty interesting. He covered up his wife Cora's death, shown on the left, saying she'd run away with another man, and he was deeply shamed by this. He was so nervous following his questioning by detectives that he left England in such haste with his lover and secretary Ethel Leneve that he actually aroused the suspicions of Scotland Yard detectives, who previously had sort of bought his story and thought he was innocent. The case was infamous in its day. It involved not only a love triangle, but also one of the first uses of forensic medicine in a British court to help crack the case. The toxicologist brought in to help the investigation, Dr. William Wilcox, was able to extract hyoscyamine from Cora's remains, and this evidence led to the guilty verdict of Dr. Crippen and his eventual death at the gallows. So, with apologies to the distraught actor playing the king in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, yes, henbane can most certainly kill. And in the right concentration, Claudius could have obtained a lethal 10 milligrams to kill his brother. Now let's examine another aspect of the ghost's story. He tells Hamlet, "And in the porches of my ears did pour the leprous distilment." Could Claudius really have murdered the king by pouring poison in his ear? As it turns out, henbane can be absorbed through the skin. First, we have evidence of women in the Middle Ages who will attest to this fact. It is said that these women who associated themselves with witchcraft would put henbane on brooms. As the henbane would absorb through the skin of their inner thighs and genital mucosa, the juice of henbane would induce hallucinations. Then, in 1918, Johns Hopkins-trained pharmacist and physician, David Israel Macht, was so curious about the validity of the King of Denmark's death that he wrote a pharmacological appreciation of Shakespeare's Hamlet on instillation of poisons into the ear. In this work, Macht described experiments with animals whereby alcoholic solutions of the belladonna alkaloids were dropped into the animals' ears. He was able to see through things like paralysis of the vagus nerve near their heart that indeed the poisons were absorbed through the ear. However, when it comes to poisoning, what is possible and what is effective require different considerations, and as otolaryngologist Dr. Basilio Aristides Koutsias noted in an article on the same topic, the skin over the tympanic membrane is not highly vascularized. Given the time then that it would take for a lethal dose of henbane to get absorbed through the ear, it seems less likely, no matter how deep the king's sleep, that Hamlet's evil uncle Claudius would have had the time to wait for such a large amount of poison to be absorbed and its effects to take hold in order to win the crown. As Dr. Koutsias and others have suggested, it is more likely that the king could have had perforations in his ear, possibly secondary to previous afflictions of otitis media, which then allowed faster access to the systemic circulation via a vascularized middle ear and digestive tract by way of the eustachian tube. If a murderer's method gives insight into their intelligence, perhaps Claudius was better fit to rule Denmark than his brother, who was so sated and somnolent following his lunch that he slept through his own murder. Poisoning through one's ear does seem a perfect crime. Is it possible, though, that henbane could have caused the king's death? The king's ghost tells Hamlet that the poison curdled like eager droppings into milk, the thin and wholesome blood. If interpreted as causing blood to clot, it doesn't seem as though henbane is the best poison to instigate a voracious cycle of the coagulation cascade. While the studious Macht did make reference to coagulation from hyoscyamus toxicity and henbane intoxication can cause red, flushed skin, other symptoms would have killed the king first. Symptoms or problems like an arrhythmia. Now, a toxin that can affect the blood's ability to clot is snake venom. In fact, the people of Denmark were led to believe the king's death was due to a snake's bite. 'Tis given out that sleeping in my orchard, a serpent stung me, so the whole ear of Denmark is by a forged process of my death rankly abused. Certainly, the Russell viper is the most famous, if not potent, medical example of a snake whose venom affects the clotting cascade. While we associate hemotoxins in snake bites with bleeding, the introduction of viper venom to blood would initially cause it to clot. However, while less formidable members of the viper family do slither about Europe, such as the Vipera berus, also known as the adder viper, their effects on the circulatory system are more localized, disrupting the endothelium to cause edema. They rarely cause death in humans. Is it possible that Shakespeare was confusing his poisons when he wrote the scene? Legumes are known to have coagulopathic properties, and kidney beans, which can be grown in Denmark's climate, along with just about anywhere else in the world, contain phytohemagglutinin, which causes red blood cells to agglutinate. However, the effects of phytohemagglutinin, while potent, can take up to 3 hours for onset, and often the marked symptoms are nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Then there's nitrobenzene, also known as oil of merbane, which can cause blood to look dark and thick, and also cause cyanosis of the skin, while causing death via respiratory failure from paralysis of the central nervous system. Nitrobenzene also comes in a potent oily form that could have been dropped into the ear of the sleeping king. The only problem with this theory is that nitrobenzene was described for the first time in Casper's Forensic Medicine, which was published in 1876, long after Shakespeare penned Hamlet. Other poisons that would have been accessible to Hamlet's uncle Claudius include ricin and arsenic. Ricin was used famously by the fictional Walter White to kill a fellow drug dealer in Breaking Bad. Unfortunately, the very real Georgy Markov was also murdered with assistance by the KGB by way of a ricin-tipped umbrella. However, the castor bean plant, Ricinus communis, requires warmer climates than Denmark, and while the poison causes many things to go wrong in the human body, clotting of the blood is not one of them. In terms of potency and onset of action, a concentrated dose of arsenic the size of a pea can bring lethal consequences. This would be convenient for Claudius, as the inside of the king's ear would have been just large enough to accommodate this murderous dose. However, arsenic acts through neurotoxicity and GI upset, invoking symptoms similar to Guillain-Barré, along with severe abdominal cramping, diarrhea, and vomiting. Without other great weapons at Claudius's disposal, it seems more likely that Shakespeare's use of henbane was deliberate. Perhaps the inconsistency comes because the symptoms of the king were attributable to the natural process of death rather than a specific means. Doctors Thomas Rudder, Gary Hatch, and Michael Falley from the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Switzerland hypothesized that Shakespeare probably attended an autopsy of an executed criminal. This was common practice in those times. There, the observant playwright would have seen post-mortem changes that include thick, clotted blood and skin discoloration. Therefore, the ghost was describing the physiology of his death rather than the effects of the poison. Shakespeare was ahead of his time in many respects, from his literary tropes to his up-to-date knowledge of medicine. I suggest that the black henbane and its ensuing symptoms were not just referenced for their poetic flair, but because Shakespeare had given reasonable thought to the manner in which Claudius would end the king's life. Furthermore, after a look at Shakespeare's use of toxins in other plays, and it seems that the guy had a thing for anticholinergic remedies. Featured here are works of art by Salvador Dali, depicting scenes from Romeo and Juliet. In this play, an unnamed poison is given to Juliet by Friar Lawrence to make her stiff and stark and cold appear like death for 42 hours, until she would awake as from a pleasant sleep. A toxic dose of scopolamine could cause coma along with a rapid and weak pulse, which would have been fatally imperceptible to her Romeo. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Fairy King Oberon, in a plot to make his fairy queen Titania appear foolish, instructs his jester Puck to find the potion Love and Idleness, so the fairy king can put it in Titania's eyes with hopes she'll fall in love with a beast. The potion's power actually causes her to fall madly in love with a nearby actor in the forest, whose head Puck has conveniently turned into that of a jackass. A relative of Black Henbane in the Nightshade family could cause this madness, which grips Titania when she's under the influence of the potion. That Nightshade family member would be Atropa Belladonna. Deadly nightshade's use by women throughout history to enhance their beauty by dilating their pupils has been well documented. Is it possible that the blind as a bat, hot as Hades, and mad as a hat are symptoms caused by the anticholinergic alkaloids of the Nightshade family were what caused Titania to believe she was in love with the ass-headed actor, Nick Bottom? Adding to the argument that Shakespeare was deliberate in his description of the poison used and symptoms experienced by the king, scholars have marveled at Shakespeare's knowledge of anatomy that is on display in the Ghost's Tale. Shakespeare was a contemporary of William Harvey, whose groundbreaking On the Motion of the Heart and Blood of Animals was published in 1628. While Harvey's work appeared 12 years after Shakespeare's death, the author's attention to the details of the human body demonstrate a knowledge of Galen and the ancient Greeks, who first made reference to arteries and veins. To strengthen the argument that Shakespeare's choice of words was for reasons more than just their lyrical quality, let's look at the story Hamlet was based on. Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, shown here, composed the story of Hamlet 4 centuries before Shakespeare put pen to paper. While the tales of Hamlet and Shakespeare's Hamlet both involve a devious uncle who commits fratricide against a king, a crime that is later avenged by the son of the murdered king, Grammaticus did not have his king killed as he is in Hamlet. Grammaticus's version of events is not nearly as detailed and is a lot less elegant. He writes, Horwendel, the king of Denmark, his good fortune stung his brother Feng, with such jealousy so that the latter resolved treacherously to waylay his brother. And behold, when a chance came to murder him, his bloody hand sated the deadly passion of his soul. So if Feng killed his brother Horwendel the king in such a bloody fashion, why did Shakespeare feel the need to construct such an elaborate, most foul, strange, and unnatural death? Claudius's stealth, decidedly unbloody murder of his brother by pouring poison in his ear is an invention of Shakespeare's and not a device necessary to further the plot. I conclude that Shakespeare was deliberate in writing the ghost's description of the king's death and its cause with the juice of cursed Hebnon. It seems fitting to close with the words of Dr. Albert Getchell, author of The Medical Knowledge of Shakespeare, which appeared in a January edition of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal back in 1907. His words explain the inconsistencies presented within the ghost's prose while highlighting the genius of the man who wrote them. Dr. Getchell writes, "Essentially, he was a dramatist and a poet. He did not follow after knowledge for its own sake, and was not over-particular about his facts. He was a playwright, not a scientist. So we never find him using his literary thought to enforce or illustrate a scientific fact. But on the contrary, his facts are always subordinate to the thought or dramatic situation in hand. One is impressed, therefore, not with the originality of his knowledge, but with the wonderful grasp that Shakespeare had of the knowledge of his time, and the artistic skill with which he used it." Thank you very much.